Good morning, dear ducks. We are here with Victoria Meller for a talk about different ideas, maybe including the new government in Netherlands, but there are maybe some ideas we talk about, so it for sure will be interesting. But for sure I can explain who Victoria is, but for sure it's better Victoria tells herself in her presentation. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. So my name is Victoria, and I'm the Vice President of the European Christian Political Youth. So we are the youth branch of the European Christian Political Party that's been around for 20 years in the European Parliament. So initially, the party started out as a movement of different Christian members of the European Parliament who wanted to gather with other Christians and exchange ideas. So initially, it was just a movement, not a party. But a few years ago, the movement transformed into a party, and we are the youth wing of that party. And we have also been around for 21 years now. And we are comprised of people from all across Europe, not just the EU, but also aspiring EU members. And we host different training programs for young Christians who want to get into politics in Europe. And we also have our own podcast, The Bristol's Breakdown. And we just are very much involved in the EU on both the EU level as well as the level of the individual member states. So that's where I'm involved in. And apart from that, I also have a background in law in both Poland and the UK. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me having you, and the idea of one of the three topics, first of one, the idea of transcendence or temporal powers, is what I think it's in the Bible, but I haven't read for years. The idea of Caesar to Caesar, God to God. Separation of powers that it's mainly implemented in United States Constitution and other countries, and the idea of plural diversity on faiths, on religion. But my problem is about not the idea of the secularism, which mainly is benefit for the proper religion. I think the capability of having faith and community a part of the idea of the state power, instead of the idea of otherness, the idea of if you are Christian, for sure, as a European, sure interested in history, the wars on religion during centuries, there was problems because my religion, my view on Christian, is the only view that connects my existence with transcendence.
Yes.
How do you see both sides? You can start with one or the other.
Yes, so how I see transcendence versus temporal powers. So, firstly, you are correct in pointing to the scripture, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's. And ever since the papal revolution under Pope Innocent III and Gregory VII, there has been a separation of temporal power and this spiritual or transcendent power. So it is very much a characteristic of Christianity that we see that there needs to be a separation of these two types of powers, and that there should be a separation of church and state. However, sometimes in modern times we misunderstand what this separation should look like, and I believe that this separation does not mean that Christianity can't and shouldn't influence in some ways the way we think about politics or policy, because I think the way we shape our policy is always through some sort of philosophical lens. And each constitution, whether it be the Polish constitution, which is the most explicit example of this, each constitution it is not axiologically neutral. It has a set of values and a certain moral framework through which it is written. And even with, for example, the US Constitution, even though it doesn't explicitly mention God or religion in the way that the Declaration of Independence does, it still has a framework of values which does stem from the Christian tradition or from different Christian doctrines, such as Imago Dei. And this doctrine of Imago Dei, that all are made in the image and likeness of God, is what gave birth to human rights and the idea of human dignity, and the fact that we are all equal virtue to our humanity, not virtue to our position within a clan or within a city-state as it was prior. So I definitely agree that there should be a separation of the temporal and spiritual powers, but I believe also that no policy area is philosophically or axiologically neutral. And I believe that even in secular societies in Europe and the West, even though we believe that the norms we live by stem from the Enlightenment or are secular in nature, I still believe that their foundation is an overhang of different Christian values which have been embedded within our culture for centuries. So they're not neutral within themselves, but they are based on that philosophical framework.
It's true. And I think it's better for the religious person having this separation, because in one case you can see your beliefs are better, but in order of what happens in the past 10 years, more or less, with the wokeism, left wokeism, it could have been imposed by the same methods within the state, and it was bad idea. Now we have some kind of right wokeism, alt-right movements with those emotional views about politics, which is very curious. In past 20 years, Pope John Paul II told about the idea of roots of Europe in Greek, Rome, and Christianity. And there start the idea of the otherness in my problem, because RAI, the public television in Italy, is one of the most famous works is about biographies, biopics on artists and popes. Until Pope John Paul II, there were many Italian popes, so it was like a obligance, the idea of having these films in the Italian radio television. And in those views about John 23, Paul VI, and John Paul II, the idea of having friends in the Jewish community, the idea of having a good vibra with other religious views, it's for me difficult because what in state relationships the otherness is recognizing the other just like I am. I am a state, the other is an state, with real rights and real situation. And in religion, it's difficult because if I recognize the other, just like I am, I'm sorry, but I would see plasticity with saying this mode. Oh dear, we go this Sunday to Episcopalian, and the next Sunday we go to Mormon, and the other we go to Catholic. No, it's not real, because your community, religious community, is the one which fulfills all your needs. So that's my problem with this issue.
Yes, but I agree with you that we should have a pluralistic society and a society which respects freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. But I believe that is possible within a Christian society to have pluralism while also being based on certain foundational Christian values that do not restrict our freedom but aim to protect the weak and vulnerable, mainly children, which I think they are usually the victims of most social experiments, whether it be in recent years with the gender ideology or different experiments within the family. So I think that we can have both a pluralistic society which respects people's freedom of conscience, but also one that takes some of those Christian values and uses them to protect the weak and vulnerable who cannot defend themselves against these ever-evolving social norms and fashions, which unlike Christianity, they are very new. They've only been around for less than 100 years, if even that, whereas Christianity has been tried and tested throughout time. And I agree with what Edmund Burke says, the 18th century British conservative. He said that our society is based on the collective, cumulative wisdom contained within our institutions and traditions. And as C.S. Lewis pointed out, modern man is usually quite arrogant in thinking that we can just make up our own rules and values and norms, and just disregard generations of traditions and institutions that have been tried and tested. So I think we need to have a balance of being open to innovation in some areas when it comes to technology and other things of that sort. But I also think we need to have a set, fixed anthropology of the human being, which views the human being in the way that has been the case for the past few generations, and doesn't aim to remake it, because it will have disastrous consequences, namely for children, but also for those that are the most vulnerable within our society, whether those with mental disabilities, etc. So I think we need to have a balance of both. And when it comes to Pope John Paul II, Obviously, he came from Poland, my country, and he's also a perfect example of a situation where the church kind of entered the political arena, because he was one of the figures that really helped and aided in the toppling of communism. And so this is an example of when sometimes when that separation may be not as sharp as we would like to be, it still can have positive impacts. And we are obviously, as the Polish people, enormously grateful for everything he did to help end communism. And yes.
Yes, it's interesting that you references Edmund Burke. It's interesting because he was British. In his time, there had passed 100 years, more or less, within the revolution that caught the throat of Charles I in England, the Glorious Revolution. And 100 years later, apparently for the world, the French Revolution is the most famous revolution in the world until the Soviet Revolution, and so on and so on. But for a liberal, the main revolution would be the English Revolution in the 17th century. And Burke, as progressive, would see the first part on the French Revolution, the first points, as positive. Good idea, good people for having new ideas, new programs, but as we can see in the French Revolution, what happened with the terror, with Robespierre and those figures, that was awful in many cases. So Burke said, well, take care, these guys are going crazy, this is a bad idea, so he became conservative. It's curious because he later will be contested by John Stuart Mill, a woman. For sure, without a woman, it would be impossible. A woman changed the mind of John Stuart Mill from the utilitarianism of Burke for a more pragmatic view, because Burke said all you do in life has been with a purpose. All.
Yeah.
And it will be very rigoristic from my point of view. But still, in the idea of the state, of course, the state, the empire of law, the rule of law, the idea of what the law has to regulate the society. And in that idea, the taxes, they have the taxes from the people, so the people has the right. The United States Constitution is a reality because the idea of the revolutionary people saying no taxation without representation, the politics, the idea of and in Poland, for sure, you know very well that idea because from the idea of Lithuania, Poland power in past disappeared, and one identity is made, although is in under the surface, because the Polish people looked on one side, oh, Russians are Orthodox, on the other, oh, Germans are Protestant, Lutheran. So, for being different, Poland are Catholics mainly.
Yes. Yes, but we do actually have a Lutheran community in Galicia. So in the south of Poland, there's a city called Bielsko-Biała. And during the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was the hub of Protestantism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So even though the empire was predominantly Catholic, this part of what is now Poland was predominantly Protestant. But yeah, it's mainly historic Galicia and specifically that part which is still predominantly Lutheran, but not many people know that. But yes, I agree with everything you said. And in terms of the French Revolution, um, uh, even though it was obviously very anti-religion and secular, it still had almost a quasi-religious character, in the same way that the punished heretics. They acted in the same way, and they also had this kind of dogmatic purity which they wanted to uphold. In the same way, I think today that certain secular movements, whether it's like the wokeism on the left that has been around, or even some branches of the woke right, they too have a quasi-religious character, in that they demand this ideological purity, and the punishment for that, for committing heresy, so to speak, is being cancelled or thrown out of their movement. So I think human beings have this inclination, whether they realize it or not, to worship something, and even when they think they're anti-religion, they still create these quasi-religions, and I think it's because of this anthropological nature of human beings that we all have a metaphysical need for myth, ritual, and ceremony. And even if those things are irreligious on their surface, they still serve to fill that metaphysical need. And that reminds me of what the late Prince Philip said, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. He joked that the French may have abolished their monarchy, but they were the number one viewers of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. So that kind of metaphysical need for the ceremony, ritual, and myth is still there, across whatever ideology or religion or lecture of people may have.
On the other side, King Farouk, in the latest days of his kingdom in Egypt, told at the end of the century there will be only 5 kings in the world. The King of England and the 4 kings of the game of cards. It's a curious idea. But using the idea of transcendence on the personal view, on the idea of what in the ancient times the people looking gods in rivers, in the horizon, in the sun, in that idea derivated on the mythologies of ancient Egypt, ancient Greek, and so on, with Mitra and any others, and then came Jesus Christ and the Bible within the past in Torah, Jewish community, and the idea of becoming Christianity. Of course, there are other views, Hinduism, Buddhism, and animism types in Africa, and other possibilities of that idea of transcendence, of spiritualism, on the idea of how I come to this world, how I am here in this world living, and what is next within the death. It's only this. It has to be more than this, and that idea you see it as a need, at a personal need of those answers, and it will be the idea of religion. But the state has to be temporal because has to manage the issues on this world, and the idea is it's curious because the time changes, and some policies are being changed in the early 20th century, because if you see, we told about Britain, the United Kingdom, the budget in several years in 19th century or the 20th century, you see too many budget on social issues. But First World War, on the socialization of some ideas of healthcare, because there were many types of armies in Britain. First of one was the idea of every street children were going together. So if there was a massacre in one battle, they lost all the street was awful. Awful moments, because there were losses in the same part of the cities. So that idea needed a social appropriation within the budget, and the expansion of the budget was in that time. And what the end ended, that budget remained as a new policy. People could say the social politics are part of long time, but it's modern thing, and so on. For sure, it's this western side in eastern part of Europe, center eastern part. Poland is just the center of Europe. I could say a recommendation, not for explaining me, because I'm part of the western part. Anne Applebaum, the book of the destruction of Eastern Europe, a book very impressive for me when I read last summer.
Yes, yeah, and I think on the topic of transcendence and temporal powers, I think when a government or regime doesn't have a sense of the transcendent, it's much easier for it to become tyrannical or totalitarian. And especially as Poles who have experienced being under communist regime, the groups which were most attacked by the state were the religious, the priests, the clergy, the intellectual elites. Anyone who had a sense of the transcendent, of something being higher than the state, was a threat to the regime. So I think the best safeguard to totalitarianism or to tyranny is leaders or governments which have some sense of the transcendent, some sense that they have to answer to something or someone higher than themselves. And I think the Habsburgs are a good example of embodying this transcendence. I think it was Leopold II, when he wrote a letter to either Bohemia or Hungary. He wrote to his people that, yes, I am your emperor, but if I ever infringe upon your local rights or your local customs, I give you the right to take up arms against me. So this shows that, like, through his faith, he very much knew that he was accountable not just to himself, but he was accountable to his family lineage, to both his predecessors and to the generations of Habsburgs after him. And he was also accountable before God for how he stewarded his power. So I think when that is missing, it is much easier for a leader to become corrupted by power, because they are not accountable to anything or anyone besides themselves. And there are many examples in the Habsburgs, where they showed this accountability to the transcendent, which in turn made them respect the principle of subsidiarity, because the empire was made of so many different ethnic groups and so many different nations and linguistic groups. And instead of or at some points, like under Franz Joseph, it became more centralized. But when the empire was at its best, they really respected this principle of subsidiarity, and the power became more dispersed and more decentralized. And I think it was the Spanish Habsburgs under Charles V, there was a maxim that they had, which was I obey, but I don't implement. Obedezco, pero no cumplo, something like that. And it basically meant in practice that when the king gave orders to, say, those who were in Latin America, the conquistadors, when he gave orders to them, they had the right to kind of reject that order if they saw that implementing it would not work for the local community or would harm the local customs or order of that community. So in that regard, they were allowed to say, I obey, but I don't implement. So I respect the order, but I'm using my right to not implement it, because implementing it would cause harm. And obviously, this legal maxim was very beneficial because they were on the ground, so they best knew what was best for the local people, whereas the king in Madrid didn't know, because he was further away. So I think the principle of subsidiarity was very much more prominent than sometimes in modern times. There are times when the EU doesn't respect this principle to the degree that it should, or even within our own states. Sometimes the government doesn't doesn't give the amount of competence that it should to local councils and local governments. So I think we should definitely learn to respect this principle from examples in history, like with the Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs in this case, where they had this very important legal maxim. So there's much wisdom to be learned from history, because history is not linear, but it's cyclical, and there are so many things that we can learn from our predecessors on things that they did right.
It's very interesting because there are many views on history, like a meta-historical debate on the idea of all going upstairs, crescents on benefits, on the idea of increasing benefits. The idea of some Slavic view, I was told it was a Slavic view, the idea of how to say, when you see the history with pessimism, the tragedy, it will come, the disaster, the dark moments, that idea. In some Slavic views, there are, or the idea of eternal return. It's mainly in Asiatic views. History is very interesting. I recommend reading the idea of the Vendée War in within the French Revolution. It's interesting because the idea of having a state religion from the top to the down, and that became the insurrection in the Vendée region. On the other hand, my friend Rubén Villamor has a new book about the Taiping Rebellion in China, 19th century. Interesting movement to be studied. You said about Spain, the Habsburgs. It's interesting because it connects the Philip II and the idea of Ferdinand first in the idea of Bohemia, Moravia, Poland. I was going to talk about the fall of Austria-Hungarian Empire, the idea of the fall of that empire, and what mainly is some people would see the idea of socialism and the revolutionary people destroy the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. False. Not. The national view inside was the fall of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The idea of we are Czechs, we want our own nation. We are Polish, we want our own nation. And mainly Hungarian side, not all the Austrian side, but it was some kind of central power in some kinds. Although the officials in the army had to learn German, yes, but one local language for the communication within the troops. But I am asked, I know the foral system within only 1,000 years of idea of our own regulation, the constitution for our powers within the 15th and 16th century, the old way and the new way in the in Biscay Republic, as second president, first vice president John Adams, we have a statue in the Gran Via in Bilbao, became a visitor to Bilbao looking for the just constitution ideas, and in Bilbao, invited by Gardoqui, who was the first ambassador of Spain in the United States, was from Bilbao, and in Bilbao had the idea of that foral system, and a member of Biscay was able to have the rule of this law until the third generation in the Americas. It's interesting. Now, in these days, we still have our taxes collected our own. State of Spain don't know anything about the contributors in Basque Country, but this goes on the land of temporal powers, because a complexity in a state, that's subsidiarity, union in diversity, it's Europeanism, but this is a view, traditional view within the Basques, Basque people who had important religious views. It's curious because it was a late conversion to Christianity, but when Basque converted to Christianity, they were very powerful in the faith. Ignatius Loyola, there is also Francis Xavier, the first Western in Japan, and the creation of Jesuitics. So it's interesting, the apportation, because it connects within my view as a national Basque in the state of Spain. But on your side, in Poland, it's interesting on the idea of that fall of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, on one person that could be said that it's Kuder of Kalergi, because the idea of the convivence inside the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was viewed very positively by this Kuder of Kalergi, and within ideas of Victor Hugo, Immanuel Kant, that were very earlier, the idea of what having that convivence in cities and regions within, okay, they are nations, but we can unite in some kind of structure. That idea of loss, of that losses that he felt, could be one of the ingredients for European community, because the haters of Europeanism would see the same satanic moods like in religion, anti-Christian, say the same anti-Christian moods on satanic views. The idea of, Europeanism was a third-rate creation. No, dear, no, it's different. And the idea of community, you can see Comecon, a community within in economics in Soviet Union, but when you go further, you see that structure was feudal. Moscow orders and the other apply. So that's the idea of, well, you can see a frame, but you have to go deeper, because if you put the world only on black or white, you fall in the fault of the colors, the magnificence of all the colors.
Yes. And it's interesting because Poland disappeared off the map for 123 years, and we were under the Prussian, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian Empire throughout this time. And with the end of World War I, we regained our statehood and our sovereignty after 123 years. However, even despite that, those who were in the partition that belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire still have a positive sentiment toward the Habsburgs and toward their empire. You can see paintings of Franz Josef all over former Galicia. And so even though during that time we didn't have our own state, because it was we were partitioned between 3 different empires, and we disappeared off the map. Under this Austro-Hungarian partition, we still had more autonomy than under the Prussian or Russian partitions. So I think this is a testament to the fact that they did exercise this principle of subsidiarity very well. Obviously, we are glad that we now have our sovereign state again, but they did do something right, that we still hold this positive memory towards the Habsburgs. And one of those things was that each Habsburg ruler was required to speak every single one of the languages of the nations within the empire. And even the son of the last emperor, blessed Karl, his son was Otto Habsburg, and obviously he had no position because the empire ended in 1918. But Otto still had to learn 12 languages that were in the previous empire. So through things of this sort, it was evident that they were trained to respect the local customs of each nation in the empire, um, instead of imposing their own will onto the people, which I think, again, this is something that should be taken into consideration by the EU more, is to respect the local customs and traditions of each member state, and to only take on the matters of competence which the nation state cannot fulfill themselves. And like you mentioned, that you're from the Basque country, Europe is so culturally diverse, and within one state there can be so many different nations. And this was also the case in Poland, which changed a bit after Stalin, sadly. But before that point, Poland was very diverse, and we had obviously a large Jewish community. And when before the eastern part of our country was taken, we also had many Ukrainians and Belarusians. We had a Tatar community, a Muslim Tatar community, which we still do, but to a much lesser extent. And in the north of Poland, there were also a lot of, in the north and the west, a lot of Germans. So we were always very diverse, but by actors who have bad intentions, this diversity is always taken advantage of to turn those groups against each other, and to break up the unity of the state. But obviously Poland is not the only one. The whole of Europe is so diverse, and you have for example Tyrol in Italy, which is more German than it is Italian, or you have Alsace in France, which again is more is a mix of French and German culture, or you have Catalonia and Basque Country in Spain, and it's a beautiful thing, but there are always some tensions which can arise, especially when the central government doesn't respect those minority groups, which can cause problems. But because you mentioned Philip II, I think I wanted to also mention, because this was on the topic of the principle of subsidiarity, and he was overseeing a letter that was meant to be sent from Lisbon to Barcelona, and the letter just said from Lisbon to Barcelona, and he said, no, you can't do that. You have to write from Lisbon to the border of the Portuguese kingdom, then from the border of the Portuguese kingdom to the kingdom of Castile, and then from the kingdom of Castile to the kingdom of Aragon. So this shows how this respect towards subsidiarity was always around, and it's not a modern invention, and in the past sometimes it was even more respected than it may be now. So yes, so it's very interesting to see how it was exercised in the past.
It's important telling the truth. The truth of what you can research in history, and in near times we are celebrating the annual idea of the victims of the Shoah. And for sure, in Poland, the idea of the police camps, it's very hurtful, very deeply, because there were no police having the rule of the camps. There were Germans, although in other part of Europe there were collaborations within Third Reich. I can see what happens in 2022 on the idea of the denazification of Ukraine, but we see in the 40s Slovakia having been a teacher state, the Ustacha in Croatia being created by the friends of so history is very complex in that idea. And for example, what happened in the September 1st in 1939 on the idea, oh, Germany started the war, yes, but the 17th of September in 1939 the Soviets became invaders to Poland. So they also started the Second World War. It's true that the day before, in the 16th September 1939, they ended the War of Hanging Gold in the East Asia, so they could start a war within the Germans, no, within the Polish. And the idea of Katyn, the massacre of Katyn in the year later, when the Germans, the Nazi regime, and the Soviets were friends, cool friends, for 2 years. And Katyn was the trial of destruction of the highest part of the society of Poland. And in Nuremberg, the Soviets tried to say, oh, Germans did Katyn. No, it's yours.
No.
It's of yours. And it's curious because it's not all past, not only that time. In 70 years later from Katyn, it's this is probably difficult to say what happened in 2010. What happened with those planes going down? And for me, there is not an accident.
No, I don't think so. And yes, with what you said about the Katyn massacre, the Brits and other Western Europeans were told at that time that it was the Germans who committed this atrocity, as opposed to the Russians. And because the flow of information was cut off and we were cut off behind the Iron Wall, the true information wasn't getting to Western Europe. And still to this day, people may not know unless they are interested in history. So I think this kind of overhang of us being cut off from the rest of Europe for some 40 years still has impact today, because there are still to this day people in Western Europe who don't see the threat that is Russia, and they have this romanticized view of Russians and they don't see them the way Poles or other Central Eastern Europeans see them. So sometimes it's hard to come to good policy or good political decisions when they don't see the same threats that we do, especially before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But many Polish leaders, such as our former president who died in the Smolensk tragedy, he did warn against the threat of Russia, but people laughed him off, and no one in Western Europe really listened. They were like, yeah, like Russia is on it to and it's the end of history, and what is he talking about? So I think it's a shame that nobody listened to his voice then, and now it's kind of too late because we're already in this situation. But we can still learn from it and listen to the Polish voices and the Central Eastern European voices who warn against Russia. But yeah, it's a difficult situation on the political level.
I didn't hear the last words, but it's interesting the idea of the pride of being part of a nation, because if we see in that idea of Second World War, the Soviets won all the war. The idea of they said, including the idea of the war in Ukraine, but the debunking of the Enigma Code started in Poland with Polish
Yes.
people. It's very important to remark that, because it ended in Bletchley Park, yes, Alan Turing, yes, but it started in Poland. Poland people without own state, being divided within Germans and Soviets, have people prepared for doing that job. And the idea of what started to have the end in Manhattan Project also started with Polish people.
Yes.
The idea of the atom, not only with Marie Curie, with was as Chopin birth in Poland, instead of other people that were had to go to Britain, and within Britain the Pact of Quebec in 1943, and so on, with the idea of General Groves, Oppenheimer, the film of Christopher Nolan, but it had a previous with Poland. It's interesting because the idea of the balance of powers in European Union changed in 2004 within the introducing of countries in Central Eastern Europe. And it's interesting because there was president of European Commission, which was French. I have the name, but I always remember the successor, Jacques Santer, but the predecessor, which was a French president of the European Commission, very important, had the idea of enlargement or having more united. And you can do both. Those fake dualities, for sure there is more answers, because the idea of I told about black or white, a good Michael Jackson album, yes, but you have more colors in reality for making decisions. For sure, you can see in the idea of the proper Poland in Selm, and the idea of how you can choose only within Morawiecki and Donald Tusk. No, dear, you have more possibilities in the politics in Poland, and for sure, upper and lower level politics, you have more answers than only two.
Yes. And thank you for highlighting about the breaking of the Enigma Code, among other things. I think Polish people definitely need to work on their public diplomacy and in promoting these things, because oftentimes many people in Western Europe or the West as a whole don't know that it was the Poles who started or contributed to these things, or some people don't know that Marie Curie was Polish because of her husband's French surname. So it's important to educate people. And yeah, with the Enigma Code, for many decades that went under the radar because we were cut off from the rest of the West, and we were under the power of the Soviets, so we couldn't really promote ourselves in this regard. But I think we definitely should increase our public diplomacy and be proud of our achievements and of our heroic figures in the past who contributed to the betterment of the world. Whether it was Marie Curie or for those who took part in the breaking of the Enigma Code. And even with our constitution, we're actually the first in Europe and the second in the world after the US to have a formal written constitution. So that's something that we're also very proud of. And when we regained our sovereignty and our statehood after 123 years of just being erased of the map in 1918, we were immediately we gave suffrage, so the right to vote to Polish women. So we were 50 years ahead of countries like Switzerland, which only did so in the 70s. And so we were very ahead on different matters. But these things are not promoted enough, and many people don't know. But we have such a the time that we were under communism is only a short period of our history, and it's nothing compared to the 1,000 years that we've been a state, and for history and culture and for achievements. But those short 40 years that we were under communism really shut us off and cut us off from the rest of Europe, from the rest of the Latin civilization that we belong to. And we've been kind of meshed with other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And just like the rest of Europe, Central Eastern Europe is also very diverse, and we're not all the same. Some of the Western Slavic countries are part of the Latin civilization. Then you have some that you have the Baltics, which are not Slavic at all, and you have such diversity within this region. But because of our communist history, we were artificially meshed into one, and to this day we are reaping the consequences of some people in the West kind of seeing us as no different to Russians or no different to Bulgarians or another state within this region. But our culture and history is so vastly different. So I think this is something that we also need to highlight in our diplomacy, because this is such a distinct region, and it shouldn't be painted over with one brush.
Maybe you have an answer. I was thinking in an issue because, of course, we had a problem in 2020, and the idea of closure, the people inside the houses, and but it was not all the close of all aspects of life. And in August 2020, there was a century within the miracle of Vistula. I'm saying why we didn't have that point, center point from my point of view, on the construction of our Europe. Why we didn't celebrate that?
Yes, I don't know. It's one of the biggest victories of the Polish people, because it was when we defeated the Russians in 1920 in the Battle of Warsaw. And the reason why we call it miracle on the Vistula is has a reason. The name is not an accident. So one of the reasons is that the soldiers who were involved in the cryptographic machines, they were actually in order to deter the Russians and to confuse them and to block the instructions from their generals. They were reading the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, and so in this way they were able to confuse them from being able to hear the actual instructions from where to go, and because of this they were able to be deterred. And the second reason that is called a miracle is because from certain reports, the Russians, even though they were a much bigger army than the Poles, and you'd think that against all odds they'd have an easy victory, they still lost. And there were reports from the Russians that they had an apparition of Mary, the Mother of God, and since they were atheistic at that time, this shocked them and scared them off. So those three reasons are why we call it the miracle on the Vistula, and it's a victory that was against all odds, but the Poles were still strategic, and they were still able to win despite being smaller in number than the Russians. And yes, I think victories like this should definitely be promoted as well, and highlighted across Europe, because we're definitely very proud of that and celebrate.
True, it's interesting because, as we could say about the precaution principle, the principle of precaution on what science can do, it's all for being done. And we see in the 79, in the 20th century, it's curious because it's connected some kind with the miracle of Vistula within the idea of the Soviets put in Eastern and Central Europe the SS-20 and SS-30, the missiles looking to Western Europe. And in NATO, there was a discussion about what we do, and they thought in next 4 years we will try to manage this for retiring this because there was against some international treaties. And but in 1983, when West Germany, Netherlands, England asked and requested the United States to push the Pershings and the so-called Euro missiles, then the Soviets, they said, "Oh, these Europeans are the fans of war. They are very enthusiastic on the war," and that idea was supported in the payment on eco-pacifist movements in the West by the Soviets. So the writing of story is very important, because for sure, if there weren't Poland people telling the truth about the miracle of Vistula, for sure there were involved Tukhachevsky, there was involved Stalin in that battle. For sure they would take back and say they were the winners and strategic distraction or so on. And that happened in the 70s and 80s, because we can see now that idea of the precaution principle linked within the nuclear power, saying, "Oh, nuclear power is very powerful, yes, but it's very painful." You can see Fukushima, you can see Chernobyl. Aparting, the idea of Chernobyl is not a problem within energy, it's a problem within the structure of the Soviets. That was the problem in Chernobyl. But you see now the Finnish, Finland in their own language is Suomi, the idea of the Greens there saying nuclear power is a green power, and the green taxonomy of nuclear power in European Parliament, European Commission. It's interesting, that idea, because in Geneva, the idea of the the what the circle we have there for experimentation CERN, the CERN, that was also the idea of not starting that because the principle of precaution. What if we create a black hole there? Oh, it would be so awful. So it's interesting that point.
Yes, yeah. And with what you said about Chernobyl and nuclear power, so to this day, Poland is still in the plans of building nuclear power plants. And the reason why it's been such a long process is because initially the first nuclear power plant was meant to be on Soviet technology, and the Polish people protested that at the time because we didn't want another Chernobyl to happen. And then after that, when we were finally free of the Soviet control, we still had this negative view of and fear of nuclear. However, now we see how important it is to be energy independent, especially in light of Russia and the dependence that Europe had on their gas, which later led to them invading Ukraine. So I think energy independence and nuclear power, I'm very much in favor of. But with the precautionary principle, again, I think there needs to be a balance, because sometimes I think in Europe we can be too overcautious to the point where we fall behind the rest of the world in innovation. But at the same time, there are other times when we take on these social experiments without thinking about the cost it will have to human beings. So I think with technological innovation, the testing for that should be done at the most dispersed and decentralized level, and precautions should be taken in regards to the effects on human beings, but not in the way that we're too cautious and we end up becoming dependent on China or America for all our AI and green technology. So there needs to be a balanced structure, a balance which respects the anthropology of the human being, and where we don't experiment with human nature. But with technology, we also need to take into consideration the adverse effects it will have on human beings, but also weigh them against long-term benefits, because even like with the wake of AI, there will be many people who will lose jobs with time, especially the middle class and those in corporate jobs. So we need to really take that into consideration, but also not halt our innovation, because already we are falling behind. And there was a Polish politician who ironically was bragging that yes, Europe may not be innovating in terms of AI, but at least we have very impressive AI regulation. So we need to do more than just regulate. We also need to innovate, but do it in a sustainable, incremental manner. Because I think all growth, all progress needs to be incremental and not radical or revolutionary, so to speak.
It's true that there is a reference in the Genesis about the giving of human the manage of nature, all with contents nature. The matter is how you manage that, and for sure 2000 of literature in Catholic institutions are very important for answer how you can manage that. For example, it's important the principle on the food, the idea of precaution, on the idea of the transgenics, the transgenetics movement on green area, and the idea of don't do that because it's very weird, very strange, and that idea, it's curious because they requested university experiments, and those experiments were taken apart on one side, crop to crop, on and ecoterrorism when to destroy that experiment before the answers, before the being put in a report, before being explained to the people. It's very curious because we were managing with the genetics within the food and everything for at least 3,000 years. 3,000 years within the products. You can see the early banana, the early platano, and you can see something very different that we have now, and was human intervention in that side. Some so-called ecologic movements are very weird, and the idea of using that principle, but in using that dogma for their internal purposes, but focused on the idea of this is not my interest, it's the human being interest, and those people is what you can hear that when you talk about Christian approach. Oh no, that's your interest, not good for human being. So that type of hypocrisy has to be debunked, indeed.
Yes, yeah. And you're right that throughout history there were these revolutions, so to speak, took place, and these interferences. However, with the technological and AI revolution, all these changes took place in such a short span of time that historically is very unprecedented. Even if you compare AI models to just 6 months ago, it's such a huge leap forward. So I think because the change is so quick and radical, the scientific experiments or the kind of studies into the effect it will have on society or human beings cannot keep up with the growth in this technological innovation. So it's very much more difficult, and this revolution of AI is even more radical than the internet revolution of the late 90s and early 2000s. So we're dealing with something very unprecedented, and we have no historic precedent really to compare it against. And myself, I don't know what the best way forward is, and how to balance this need for keeping up with the BRICS and with the states, and also safeguard our citizens and the common good. So I think this is a challenge which has only just begun, and the next few years will paint the need for what solutions are best, but it's very unprecedented.
I don't want to sound like Sheldon Cooper explaining Penny and the idea, but in ancient Greek, there was the union within philosophy and science, practical science, physics, chemical and everything in one person, like Pythagoras and that generation. But in the centuries to go, there were a separation within science and philosophy. And philosophers were thinking about one another things, and the practice was indeed without the idea of that ethical view that was the negotiate of other parts of university and knowledge. It's curious because, as you said, the idea of AI, artificial intelligence, and that movement, and the idea of internet, even though, and that world, it's needed of that background of ethics, of one view, humanistic view of what for. It's interesting because we can see it also in war. Yes, we have bullets, we have tanks, we have ships, we have everything, but without a doctrine within the use of that guns, that armament, it's unuseful. It's not useful for the purpose it has to be done. So, in those ideas, the network, the idea of the personal computers, the intelligence, the artificial intelligence, you have to have that doctrine. And in our world, it will be ethics, some kind of structural ethics.
Yeah. And the question is, which, in our current context, which is post-Christian or morally relativistic and pluralistic to an extreme extent, which moral framework will be used to inform our decisions about AI, and which ethical framework will be used. So I think that's also something that we'll probably have to grapple with in the next, not even decade, but within the next few years, if this growth continues at the same pace as is the case now. It's hard to know which framework we will even base this on.
It's true, it's a deep debate, but in a closer idea, the idea of countering, we told about Russia, it's also there China. The idea of two Chinas, because the principle of one China would see the idea of one of those have the right of the government of all the China, but who is the best China to be declared the China that wants inside Taiwan, Peking. It's another idea, but inside the idea of having fifth columnist, in Spanish it will be said quinta columnistas, the idea of enemy within, inside, in order to be paid to China. We have eco-pacifist movements that tell the people no mining, no transformation of that minerals we have here, that rare lands supposed to be only in China. We have the monopoly of that idea, but we have here. Sweden has, Denmark has, there is also in Spain, but those dogmatic views have been pulled by political professionals in syndicalism, in trade unions, I might say, politics, parties, in members of parliaments, and the idea is we do not that job here. That would be very important for economy, and we do that for giving that to China, and that gives up our independence. as countries, as European members, as a continent. It's a problem.
Yes, and what you said about the eco not many, going back to Russia, not many people know this, but in 2014, the NATO Secretary General admitted that there was Russian funds that were aiding green NGOs within Europe and trying to disincentivize them from continuing on being energy independent on non-renewable sources. So it was very much in the interests of Russia to fund these green NGOs in Europe to keep us as dependent on Russian gas for as long as possible, which later made the annexation of Crimea possible, and then ultimately the invasion of Ukraine. So it is very much in the interests of these tyrannical regimes that Europe is not energy independent and that we're not resource independent. And currently, we are, I think, 98% dependent on all of our rare earth elements that power our defense economies and green technology. We are dependent primarily on China and also on some other commodities. We are dependent on other states such as Malaysia, Russia, etc., but primarily on China. So even Ursula von der Leyen has admitted this in 2022, and I believe also in 2024 she mentioned this. And while there have been some attempts to try and legislate on this matter in the EU, and so far it has only really been empty slogans and discussions, but there haven't been that much concrete steps being taken. And even though we have this potential, even with Greenland, there are so many resources there and so many rare earth elements which are present in Greenland or even in France, but and Ukraine as well. But we're not taking advantage of those resources, and instead we're becoming more and more dependent on these regimes to power everything from our defense equipment to our renewable green tech to smartphones and the lithium for the lithium ion batteries and electric vehicles. So the more that we legislate these ambitious net zero targets, the more we are dependent on these individual commodities, minerals, and rare earth elements, which we do not mine or process ourselves, but instead we import from often regimes which have very different moral frameworks from us, and who may not always be convergent with us politically. So this is a very dangerous strategy that we're pursuing, and especially in a time when there's so much geopolitical uncertainty and this myth of there always being peace and it being the end of history is now over. So we can't guarantee that there will always be peace in the Pacific, or that Russia will stop just at Ukraine. So we really need to take this seriously and really work to become independent in terms of energy, in terms of resources, and not just listen to NGOs who put pressure on us without thinking about the cost to switch. And often these NGOs are funded by enemies like Russia, who have other interests than we do. So we can't let ourselves be manipulated by these NGOs.
For example, the idea of Gerhard Schroeder being paid by Rosneft, for example. It's true that in this world of this misconfidence of powers willing to be more than they are and possibly failing, I don't see Russia being a superpower. They only have nuclear weapons, and for sure they are unuseful. For sure, better not going to practice with guns are unuseful in Russian weapons, nuclear weapons. But for sure, China also will fall in some time in the idea of not having the superpower they are willing. But in the world, the so-called president of the United States is the one that have hours. It's interesting, the idea. Have hours having to wait President Duda of Poland outside the West Wing for only 10 minutes of discussion. Only 10 minutes. It's that Trump. And the idea of, Poland is the best friend Europe. President Duda, the head of state of Poland, being attacked in his personality. It's interesting saying as Europeans, divided we fall, united we can prevail.
Yes. And right now it's more difficult than ever when our Euro-Atlantic relations are at stake, and in times of geopolitical uncertainty, Poles no longer feel safe, and we no longer feel that our allies will come to our aid should we be attacked by Russia. So it's a difficult time, and we need to strengthen our alliance with other European states because we have the most convergent interests with our European neighbors because we're geographically because of our geography, we have more converging interests than we do with the United States. And so I hope that initiatives like the Free Seas Initiative, which is between Austria and Greece and other countries within Central Eastern Europe, through initiatives like this, I hope that we can safeguard ourselves against the threat of Russia, and that we can also work with the Nordic states who also have converging interests, and maybe even with our fellow EU members who also don't always have the same converging interests because we're from the West. So they may not always see the threat of Russia in the same way that we do, but this is something that is of utmost importance because we can't guarantee that the US will come to our aid, especially with the current administration. So we need to think strategically and safeguard ourselves to the best, to the highest capacity that we can.
It's real. It's very realistic, that point of view. I think we have been traveling through the 3 points proposed. So if it's a good thing for you, we can do some type of conclusions, having finishing of this very grateful dialogue.
A conclusion on all 3 points or in general?
On the ideas in this talk.
Yeah. So firstly, with transcendence versus temporal powers, my main conclusion was that there needs to be a separation of church and state, and that there needs to be a separation of temporal versus transcendent powers. I do believe that each political and legal framework is philosophically based and is not axiologically neutral. And I believe that the Christian foundation that has influenced our legal framework in Europe is the most optimal one compared to the ones which are much younger in age and are not always have not always protected the common good or uphold the dignity of the human person. So I believe that we need to uphold the separation while also being realistic about no policy or legal framework being completely axiologically neutral. And with the second point of the precautionary principle, my conclusion is that we need to have a balance between not stifling our growth and not stifling our innovation, but also measuring our actions against the cost that it may have to human beings. And also, I believe that this relates predominantly to our technological innovation, and uh, don't um, I don't support any radical changes to that would alter the anthropological nature of human beings, such as was the case in the previous years with gender transitions and things which had as their purpose to remake human nature. So I believe the precautionary principle should be more relaxed, maybe towards some technological innovation, but should always seek to safeguard the human person and not try to remake human nature, and also not try to encourage progress at a radical pace, which doesn't take into account the good of the human being. And then the last point of the current problems we're facing now, I believe it is our fragile Euro-Atlantic relations, which change from day to day, and we constantly are uh, surprised by what's coming out of the new administration in the States, and we don't know what the future will hold. So I believe we should, as Europe, build strong regional allies such as the Free Seas Initiative, or just as the EU grow stronger cooperation so that we can safeguard ourselves against potential military threats, but also keep up with the constant changes within the global balance of power, which is constantly shifting towards the BRICS, or it's not longer Europe that is the strongest economic and technological powerhouse. So we need to stick together and focus on growing stronger in these areas, so that we don't get left behind and become an open air museum in the future.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting having this talk with you. And
Likewise, it was a very interesting conversation.
thank you very much. Maybe we can get back in another talk in future.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for having me, and good evening.